Okay, so first of all, I would like to welcome everyone in this specific event of MCC School of International Relations. First of all, thank you for the opportunity, and I would like to take a quick introduction of you. Firstly, Raffaele Ben-Levi, PhD, is the director of the Churchil Program for Strategy, Statesmanship and National Security at Tico Fund Israel, and other specialist is Atyla Demko, Professor Atyla Demko. He's the head of the Center of Geopolitics at Mathias Corvinus Collegium, and our today's topic will be the Russian-Ukrainian war in the perspective of Israel and the perspective of Hungary. And I would like to start with the first question, which would be, what was the relationship of the two countries with Russia before the war, and what was the relationship of the two countries with Ukraine before the war? First of all, I would like to ask you to share your opinion about
okay, topic, sure. Well, first of all, it's great to see you all. It's great to host you here at TICFA in Jerusalem. I think it's very important, the connection between our two organizations, between TICFA and MCC, and I hope this is the beginning of what we become more in-depth cooperation. All right, so Israel and Russia relationship and Israel-Ukraine relationships have both been complicated. They're complex. They have both, I'll say Russia first, we have both common interests as well as conflicting interests. Okay, so I'll speak to a few of both of those. So common interests include a mutual diaspora, meaning that there are around 150,000 Jews living in Russia, which are Israel's concern. Whether they move here or they live there, it's still Israel's concern. And there's about 1 million Israelis of Russian background who live in Israel. And Russia sees them as part of their concern, and their well-being is their concern. So there's a sort of connection there that's not going away and anytime soon. We have strong trade relations, diamond industry, wheat, energy, constructions, Israeli-Russian businessmen that facilitate a lot of trade. There has been in the background trade with drones, even with Israeli drones and technology, not the top line, but something like that. They both have an interest in resisting or opposing the spread of Islamism. Right? Both Israel facing Islamist terror groups, as well as Russia having a large Muslim minority and having to deal with growth of terrorism or spread of terrorism. So there's a strong common security interest in opposing that. And even in the Chechnya war in the early 2000s, Israel was supportive of Russia's actions against that because it understood the threat. Russia has religious sites in Jerusalem, though the control of which has been some legal conflicts in some points, but over the most part, it's something that connects the countries and forces us to cooperate or to be in touch. And of course, the past few years, there's been cooperation in Syria, meaning since around 2014, when Russia developed or raised its military presence in Syria, Russia essentially controls Syrian airspace. Israel has to act and take actions in Syrian airspace. So we have direct military deconfliction going on with Russia for years, for a number of years now. On the other hand, things are not all rosy, right? In the background, during the Soviet Union, the Soviet was the major arms supplier for Israel's enemies. And that's one thing. Even since the Russian Federation, Russia still has a positive working relationship with Israel's worst enemies, which is Iran, right? And it has a cooperative relationship. It's not entirely supportive of Iran, but it's sold Iran nuclear technologies. It's a nuclear power plant in Bushehr. It's sold air defense systems to Iran, and it continues to cooperate with Iran. So that's a big conflict. Of course, in the broader sense, Israel is strategically aligned with the United States and the West more broadly, which Russia sees as its largest rival. So we can't, really feel comfortable, and it also is suspicious of, what Israel does with its information and all that. And Russia has also consistently supported the Arab claims and the Arab side, at least rhetorically, in the ongoing conflict, whether it's Palestinians or against Arab states in general. right? And in the UN and all that. So it's not like Israel has this, purely cooperative relationship with Russia either. Should I go to Ukraine as well first?
Maybe
we'll go back.
Maybe we ask about it a bit.
So first of all, thank you very much for hosting us here at Tikva Foundation. It's really generous of you, and I'm very happy to be here in Jerusalem, the heart really of the world, or at least our Western world. I think, to analyze Hungarian-Russian relationship, we have to go back a bit in history, but I will be very fast with that. So for at least a century, in the 19th century, Russia was seen as the biggest threat to Hungary, since Hungary had a lot of Slavic minorities, Slovaks in old Hungary, the pre-Trianon borders Hungary, Slovaks, Serbs, Ruthenians who were incited by this pan-Slavic ideology. So for at least until 1920, Russia was the main threat for Hungary. It's not very well known that's how Hungary saw it. So when Russia was defeated in 1918, Hungarians and Austria-Hungary thought we won the war. And actually didn't happen because our front line collapsed in the south, in Thessaloniki. But what I want to tell you that for a very long time, this was the main threat, Russia. And actually it was also like during the Second World War, since we saw what happened to Poland, which is a country very close to us, and then what happened to the Baltic states and Finland. And Hungary helped Finland, tried to help Poland. And of course we fought the war. Again, it was the Soviet Union, but in Hungary, Soviet Union was always seen basically as an extension of Russia. So again, that was a very shocking moment in our history, let's say the capture of Budapest, which was of course liberation for the Jewish community, but it was a true massacre for many others. And actually some of the Jewish minority also suffered because of the Russian or the Soviet things. And Raoul Wallenberg was taken and basically killed by the Soviets, or he died in custody. So that part of the history is quite dark, and it became really the darkest moment was in a way 1956, the Hungarian Revolution, which was crushed by Soviet troops. But again, in Hungarian mind, it was Russian. So the main slogan of the revolution was "Ruski go home," "Ruski domoy." But after 1990, after the Soviet withdrawal, which went very smoothly, the geopolitical situation for Hungary has changed. So Russia is no longer a neighbor of Hungary. We have Ukraine between us and Russia, and that's one of the major changes, that the big eastern neighbor, a much bigger eastern neighbor, is no longer Russia but Ukraine. And in the case of Baltic states and Poland, the border remained. For us, the closest Russian border is more than 1,000 kilometers away. So it's totally a different situation than we used to have historically. And what happened? After a period of tension with Russia, that was in the 90s and until the middle of the 2000s, Hungary started to open the relationship, and Russia also started to open. It happened during the socialist liberal government in around 2006 or 7, when there were meetings with Vladimir Putin, when there were discussions of the nuclear power plant extension or the new nuclear power plant. So there's a huge misperception in the West that it was started by Prime Minister Orban. No, the Russian-Hungary relations started to improve after basically centuries of very bad relations during the prime ministership of Ferenc Gyurcsány. And it continued during the prime ministership of Viktor Orban for one obvious reason. Russia was the main supplier of Hungarian gas, Hungarian oil, and Hungarian nuclear fuel, and Hungarian nuclear technology. So basically, it was a given, starting from the 70s and 80s, because we built the nuclear power plant. So actually, that was the first big thing, that we built the nuclear power plant in the 80s, the Paks 1 power plant, which gives half of the electricity for the country, a small thing, half of the electricity for a country. And then we built up a gas heating system for the country, because natural gas is much more healthy and much more environmentally good than wood or coal. So we changed the heating in the country. I think on the whole Eastern Bloc we changed the most, which was seen as very progressive at the time. But now it's a big vulnerability for Hungary that households need Russian gas. Not industry, not fertilizer making, but households are very big. And what happened what made us even more vulnerable to Russian gas is that we had a quite huge internal gas production. We have gas fields and oil fields, but they started to decline in the 90s. So for example, in 1990, we had 4 billion cubic meters internal production, and we needed only 6 or 7 billion cubic meters from Russia. And today we have 1.5 billion cubic meters internal production, and most of the remainder we need it from Russia. So actually the Hungarian-Russian relationship since let's say the middle of the 2000s was a good business relationship based on our interest, and of course it was Russian interest to sell as much gas and nuclear technology, nuclear fuel as possible. So it was a rather good business relationship, but it was never a historically good relationship. So what is the difference between, let's say, Serbia and the Serbian mindset and the Hungarian mindset, or even the Slovak average mindset or the Bulgarian mindset? It's far more pro-Russian than the Hungarian. I talk about the people. In Hungary, there is no, we are not a Slavic country. We were historically very much afraid of this pan-Slavic cooperation. So there is no such a given sympathy to Russia. But there is one thing which is very different from the other countries, and maybe I will talk about it more in the Ukrainian, when we talk about Ukraine. But actually Ukraine replaced Russia as the big Slavic neighbor, and Ukraine is the country with the Hungarian minority and some of the holiest Hungarian sites. I will talk about this. And unfortunately, Ukrainian-Hungarian relationship took a turn for the worst after the Maidan revolution, because Ukrainians started to, let's say, impose the language and symbols upon the Hungarian community. And this is going back to Russian relations. This is what changed the mindset of many Hungarians towards Russia. The originally most hostile part of Hungarian society was the most nationalistic part. So interestingly, today, those who are most pro-Russian are the most nationalistic parts. But when you ask, are you ready to fight Russia? Actually, those who are the most pro-Russian are the most ready to fight Russia at the same time, because they are the most nationalistic part of the society. So there is a party called Mi Hazánk, or Homeland. That's the most pro-Russian. It's not the government, it's the most pro-Russian. And usually the hard right voters are the most pro-Russian, simply because they see Ukraine as a threat. But I will elaborate on that when we talk about Ukraine.
Okay, so maybe we should go on with the connection between Israel and the Ukraine. What's your opinion about it?
Okay, yeah. So it's also a relationship with a certain amount of complexity. First of all, historically, in the Jewish collective mindset, Ukraine is associated with Cossacks, is associated with slaughter of Jews. Okay, you have to understand that in the Ukraine, when Ukraine started forming its national identity with the Khmelnytsky uprising about 300 years ago, along with uprising, they also slaughtered more Jews within a few years. Then this was essentially like a Holocaust up until the Holocaust, right? This was like the worst slaughter of Jews from the end of the Second Temple up until the Nazis Holocaust. And this was remembered, and this is remembered in Jewish mindset as a particularly traumatic event. And now on top of that, there was also the Ukrainian cooperation with Nazis in murdering Jews during the Second World War as well. So as far as the broader society goes with the idea of Ukrainian nationalism, it's mostly negative. Now that doesn't mean that there wasn't also cooperation, and there was also many Ukrainian Jews that lived there, and then the big issues were also punctuated by periods of cooperation and hosting. But overall, that's sort of the background. But when Ukraine was founded as an independent country in the 90s, Israel established diplomatic relations with it, and they had a cooperative relationship, which mainly trade in wheat and as well as tourism, and also particularly in Israeli tourism to Ukraine because of the pilgrimage that happens once a year, where Jews from all over the world go to visit Uman in Ukraine. So that's like 30,000 Israelis come every year. So on the one hand, so that's a connection that that many people in Israel want to continue. On the other hand, I can tell you, friends that have been there, they report to me that they don't get a positive vibe from the Ukrainian host. But there's a cooperative diplomatic relationship. Ukraine has voted against Israel since its independence, pretty much, on mainly anti-Israel resolutions in the UN Security Council, including just this past month, where the Palestinian Authority is trying to take its issues to the ICJ. Hungary voted with Israel on that issue. On the other hand, I also want to balance it out that I think it's clear that the historic Ukrainian anti-Semitism, people are willing to recognize it. They're willing to put that into history and move on and move forward, especially as today Ukraine has a Jewish president. So it's very difficult to try and say that, oh, this is a Jew-hating country when they've elected a Jewish president. So again, it's also complex. Overall, though, and if I compare to the relationship with Ukraine to Russia, there's a lot less. It's a lot smaller scale, both of trade and certainly of strategic interests. We have a strategic need for cooperation with Russia, whereas with Ukraine, up until recently, it hasn't been. They have no interest, they have no presence in the Middle East. They don't have strong relationship with other Middle East actors. It's just been a much smaller issue.
Yeah, I see. And what about Hungary?
So, as I said, Russian-Hungarian relationships were very bad historically. And I can tell you that Ukrainian-Hungarian relationship was much better. So actually, there was no Ukraine before the 20th century. But there were Ukrainian, let's say, or pro-Ukrainian principalities in the neighborhood of Hungary. And there were sometimes wars, but generally there was no big tension. And of course, after Poland took over that area, and with Poland that was excellent relationships throughout the ages. So that's the place for centuries where we didn't expect attack. That was after, of course, the Mongolian invasion. So I speak about the 15th century. Hungary was always looking to the south as a threat historically to the Ottomans, to the Muslim, let's say, attack on Europe. That's how we saw it. Maybe it's too crude to say it today, but
I think that's accurate.
But that's how we saw it, since our churches were converted to mosques, and a lot of let's say slavery happened during that time. So Ukraine and this northeast was not seen as a problem or as a threat. And then when Russia took over in the form of Soviet Union, again, I think we disliked the Soviet Union the same as the Ukrainians disliked the Soviet Union. But there was one moment before the Soviet Union, that is 1920, when some ancient Hungarian areas were transferred not to Ukraine but to Czechoslovakia. And of course it had a Ruthenian, we call them Ruthenian majority, but basically close to Ukrainian speaking or close to Ukrainian language. So let's call them Ukrainians. And today they say that they are Ukrainians, or most of them, they don't call them Ruthens or Ruthenians. The problem was that Czechoslovakia not only took the Slavic area of that province, or it's not even a province, the province was created at the time, it was separate counties, so it was never a unit. What is today Transcarpathia in Ukraine is not a historic unit of Hungary. It has nothing to do with history, it has everything to do with geography. That a railway line was given to Czechoslovakia to connect it to Romania, and that railway line, on both sides there were a lot of Hungarian villages. So the population of that province, at the time, about 25% was Hungarian, but they almost all lived next to the Hungarian border. And that created tension with Czechoslovakia and animosity with Czechoslovakia, since the Hungarians never wanted to join Czechoslovakia. And after the war, this was transferred to the Soviet Union. But the Hungarians were never angry for this at Ukrainians. They were angry at the Czechs, at Prague, and at Moscow, that these Hungarian parts were transferred. And it's very important to understand it's not only like the people there, not only like the Hungarian community who lived there for more than 1,000 years. So they are not, there are some misconceptions in the West and in Ukraine that they were settled there during the Austro-Hungarian monarchy. No, they were since the start of the Hungarian Principality in the 9th century. And actually Hungarians lived what is today Ukraine at least since the 8th century. So we talk about far more than 1,000 years. They are not newcomers. In Hungarian language and culture is not newcomer in Ukraine. It's much older than Crimean Tatar on the territory of Ukraine, and still Tatars have a different treatment in Ukraine. So that is one thing we emphasize always, that Hungarians are ancient inhabitants with the graves going back to 800 something or even 700s in what is today Ukraine, not in Zakarpatskoye Oblast, but other parts of Ukraine. And there was only one historically problematic thing with Ukraine. So it's an excellent relationship throughout the history. The Ukrainians, the Ruthenians were called the most loyal people of the Hungarian kings, and especially of Rákóczi, who was a Hungarian prince. And this excellent relation had only one bump, and I have to admit it was done by the Hungarian army in 1939, which we thought as a liberation of this region. Many of the Ruthenians, by that time, they developed national consciousness and being part of the Ukrainian nation, and they defended that area, and a few hundred people died in the Battle of Hust, near Hust. And of course, it's not recognized enough in Hungary that it's a pain for Ukraine, because we only saw our own, that we liberate our own. But of course, we have to recognize that. But otherwise, until I think 2014, or 2017, it was a very good relationship. Also after the collapse of the Soviet Union. We were celebrating the collapse of the Soviet Union, I think, together with the Ukrainians, or together with the Poles, because we saw Soviet Union as an oppressive force and as a threat. So actually Hungary was the first country to remove all the Lenin statues and all the communist statues, and they are in a statue park. So what Ukraine is doing today, or in the last few years, Hungary did it in 1990. Or 1991. So we totally removed the Soviet past from our country. And for a while, because of this, because of the common interest, there was a very good relationship with Ukraine. We were, I think, the second country after Poland to recognize the independence of Ukraine. We had a treaty with Ukraine on, we recognized the border, and they recognized the rights, cultural rights of the Hungarian minority. So our cultural places were kept in a very good shape by Ukraine. Our flag could fly, or at least the Hungarian colors could fly, and we appreciated that. And we appreciated very much the Ukrainians were not trying to assimilate the Hungarian community, not trying to push them out or not trying to assimilate. I couldn't say the same about some other neighboring countries. In terms of Serbia, in the late 90s or in the 90s or even in the early 2000s, there was attacks on the Hungarians, killings, pressuring of to leave. There was nothing like that in Ukraine. So we really appreciated Ukraine a lot. But what happened after the Maidan was already in 2014 the rise in attacks. So what is not known in the world, that there were hundreds, if not thousands, of attacks on the Hungarian community, which is ranging from very small thing, like when you are talking on your mobile phone, you are told that on Ukrainian street you shouldn't speak in Hungarian. Or let's say spraying of a Hungarian statue or a grave, or putting them on fire. And actually there were some bombings, but with the bombings we see Russian hand too. So some of these incidents, of these hundreds of incidents, actually were done by the Russians to raise the problem between the two countries, between Ukraine. So it's a false flag operation, especially in the Ungvar-Uzhgorod attack, which almost killed one person. We see a Russian hand. But still, I have to say that most of these incidents were done by Ukrainian nationalists, like marches with with this Ukrainian rebel flag, the red and black flag, and knife to the Hungarians. And of course, all of this was very badly received in Hungary. But that was not the Ukrainian state, that was Ukrainian nationalist. I'm just explaining because nobody understands why Hungary is different than other countries. But the problem was that in 2017, the law started to come, education law, language law, which really restricted Hungarian language. And the biggest problem was that the Ukrainians promised us that EU languages, or that's what we believe, that our language will not be part. We understand that they want to push back Russian because of history, but 0.3% of Ukraine is Hungarian today. So what is the problem with the Hungarian language? We didn't get it, and we still don't get it. Why they did it? Because we were supporting Ukrainian NATO membership, we were supporting EU membership, we were supporting Ukraine with money. I personally visited in missions Ukraine several times, the front lines. We were supporting Ukraine with this, that we paid other countries to see what the Russians are doing in Ukraine. We paid the trip for Denmark, we paid it for the V4 countries to show their side or our side in NATO what the Russians are doing. So we did quite a lot, and we give them money to buy weapons, training, healthcare for Ukrainian soldiers. We felt that we are not reciprocated. And so the relationship went down really badly after 2017. I'm not saying that every Hungarian commentator or every Hungarian politician was always very wise, especially on the hard right about Ukraine or about Ukrainian sensitivities, but still the laws were made in Kiev. And the laws and those incidents were not stopped by Ukrainian police. Let's say this incident of threatening the Hungarian community basically with killing. And it's not known in Ukraine, it's not known in the West, it's not known basically anywhere. And since the war started, and that's now a major point, that Hungary decided not to send weapons to Ukraine. But I go back to the first answer. So we are dependent on Russia in a way more than most of the other European countries, not because of Prime Minister Orban, but because of the decisions in the 70s and 80s, so 40, 50-year-old decisions to connect it to the Soviet Union very closely. This decision to have cleaner energy instead of coal. So actually it was a progressive decision for Hungary to change from coal to gas, but it meant that our gas consumption went far. And we couldn't do anything about our declining gas production. So actually the Hungarian relationship to Ukraine, to Russia is a business relationship with, on the basis, rather negative emotions, but not openly negative emotions. But with Ukraine, now it's an emotional relationship. It's not a rational issue anymore. We feel that Ukraine is only taking our aid in terms of money, because we give money to Ukraine, food, fuel, we take the refugees, and actually we vote with Ukraine in the UN. And in most places, we are not very supportive of the sanctions on terms of energy, because we need the energy and we think it's foolish anyway for Europe, because we will lose more than the Russians. That's my absolute conviction, that we cannot help Ukraine if we make ourselves poor. We can help Ukraine much less, actually. If we give the opportunity to Russia to reroute the oil to India and other countries, we will not even hit them that hard, and it's happening. So this is a difficult relationship, and unfortunately it became emotional from both sides. That many Hungarians start to see Ukraine as a very problematic country, as the new Russia for us, a new big eastern neighbor who is not very friendly, and who is acting basically like the Russians against the Hungarian minority and Hungarian language and Hungarian history, because there is also, we feel there is a rewriting of history in Ukraine about our common past, and they are rewriting it in a negative way, exaggerating for example, this battle in 1939 had about a few hundred dead, and now the Ukrainians talk about 30,000 dead, which is absolutely not true, or some Ukrainians. So unfortunately, it's not a good relation. Unfortunately, I think that it's very hard to improve without the improvement of the Hungarian community's status. and the status of Hungarian statues, graves, and historical sites. And I believe that it's the interest of Ukraine to change this. But of course, they are also emotional because I think they truly believe that Hungary is with Russia, despite voting with Ukraine, despite helping with Ukraine, despite voting most sanctions. I tell you one example, and I stop this very long answer, that we sanctioned more than 1,200 individuals. Hungary voted. And of course, we didn't sanction one, Patriarch Kirill, who is of course an important religious figure, and I understand the Ukrainians are angry about it because Patriarch Kirill was not very nice to Ukraine, and generally he's not a very positive person. We can say that, but again, more than 1,200 were sanctioned. So what you look at the 1,200 or one person. So I would always underline that Hungary actually is doing 95% what other Western countries are doing, or 90%. The remaining 10% is some talk about, we should think about sanctions, but I think it would be good for Ukraine too, not to push into this direction, because Europe is going to get weaker with this. And the other is this minority issue and the weapon issue. So I think maybe 85% we are as supportive as any other EU or NATO country, and you have this diversion from the others. But it can be again partly explained by we need Russia more than the others, and partly explained by unfortunately these negative emotions, because what we see of Ukrainization of our people, changing of history, and general nationalism, Ukrainian nationalism towards Hungary, and even I have to say there were some threats from certain Ukrainian circles in terms of building up bases next to Hungary, military bases, which is in the face of this extremely terrible murderous Russian invasion, that was really silly, that to see Hungary as a threat. Hungary is not a threat to Ukraine. It's a NATO member, EU member, and we would like to see Ukraine in EU and NATO. But the basic thing that Ukraine will have to change in terms of the Hungarian community and history.
Thank you very much. My next question would be about that. What was the first reactions of the two countries when the first news arrived about the Russian aggression in Ukraine in terms of governments and in terms of society?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay, so well, given the picture that I laid out of Israel's relationship with Russia, so its initial reaction was on the one hand of sympathy toward the Ukrainians and offering of humanitarian assistance. They set up a field hospital and helmets and sent various equipment of that sort. But on the other hand, it has been practically, on other terms, neutral. And meaning it was not willing, and hasn't been up until now as well, to send any kind of lethal weapons, and not even air defense systems, which are sort of defensive, but they have strategic implications more than humanitarian equipment. Israel also offered to absorb fleeing Ukrainian Jews. Up until today, it's absorbed something like 20,000 Jews. Now, these are people that are allowed to move to Israel under Israeli law, under the Israeli law of return. Whether they're entirely Jewish or half Jewish or have one Jewish grandparent, that's Israeli law. So they're Jewish enough as far as Israeli law goes. And so that was a huge operation, absorbing them, and it's still an operation, absorbing them and trying to settle them. It also offered to absorb a number of thousands of Ukrainians who have no Jewish background, just if they wanted to come. They were offering that. That's, I would say, initially. Israel was, also it's worth mentioning that in the first few weeks, the Prime Minister, Naftali Bennett at the time, so he went on a trip to try and mediate between the sides. He went to meet with Putin for a few hours. He met with Germany. He spoke to Zelensky. For some reason, or maybe logically speaking, because Israel had a direct connection, but was also sort of seen as kind of outsider, it seemed that there was potential to play some sort of mediating role. It was ultimately unsuccessful. And in Israel, people argue about whether this was a good idea at all. Some people say it was a good idea because there was a chance maybe we could be helpful because of a unique position. And it was even good for Israel because it put Israel in a central position as a mediator, as opposed to what usually is in the one who's other people are trying to mediate us. On the other hand, people say this was just sticking your head in somewhere where it doesn't belong, and it was a stupid idea and it never had a chance in the first place. So I don't know, at the end of the day it wasn't successful. It doesn't mean it was necessarily a bad idea to try. So if I just speak of the initial reactions, that's what I would say.
So disbelief, I think it was from the government and from the public. Nobody really believed, except very few experts that Russia will do this. I started to believe a few days before, when the Donbass was recognized, that Russia, and then I said maybe 50-50. We saw the Russian forces as totally inadequate. We saw Ukrainian forces as strong. So we were totally surprised. Or military intelligence, or everybody was like, this Russian force is just not enough against Ukraine. And actually we were right, but we were not right that the Russians will still attack. I think there was a big change in terms of how Russia and Putin is seen by let's say the left wing and the liberal part of Hungarian society always disliked Putin and Russia. And the right was disliked it before, let's say, the 2000s. Almost everybody disliked Russia before. And then, as I said, started this more pro-Russian, more understanding of Russia, and now it changed. So the right also split. So the left and the center is against Russia, but now the right is also split about Russia. So that was a big change, that now the majority, what is not very well known in Ukraine or in Western Europe, supports Ukraine in terms of condemning the Russian invasion, in terms of seeing Russia as the aggressor. So actually, if you look at European Union data, there is more support for Ukraine in Hungary than in Slovakia or in Bulgaria. I'm talking about the people. As for the government was very clear that Hungary says that Hungary strongly condemns the aggression. Hungary is open to Ukrainian refugees without limits, and a lot of laws were changed just to accommodate Ukrainian refugees, and basically in days. So Hungary did quite a lot to accept Ukrainian refugees. Hungary did not offer weapons, very pronouncedly did not offer weapons, but we offered, again, healthcare for Ukrainian soldiers. So if we heal Ukrainian soldiers, that means that we are helping Ukraine, not Russia. And also we offered humanitarian aid, which, food and fuel is also connected to war. So if we give food and fuel, we are helping the given country. So some call it Hungary is neutral, but Hungary is not neutral. Hungary is supportive of Ukraine, despite the very strong emotional, let's say, break with Ukraine in the last 5 years. And Hungarians generally are totally shocked by what Russia is doing in Ukraine. And this is true, again, not only for the liberal center, which is about half of the country, but for a large part of the other half. So except for the hard right and the extreme right, I think Russia's stance and Russian prestige in Hungary nosedived a lot, even at the beginning of the war. But now with more than 8 months or 9 months of war and the Russian, let's say, very poor performance on the front lines, the Russian, let's say, might or military is, prestige is very much down in Hungary. So the general thing was a surprise, disbelief, and a lot of prestige for Russia. And for the government, the government felt, but the main thing, and I forgot, most of the people had one wish, that we have to stay away from this war. We had World War I, we lost 35% of our people, and a large part of the territory which would have voted for Hungary if there is a vote, but there was a land grab at the end of the First World War I, not a vote. Second World War was a terrible tragedy. So Hungarians decided, majority, left or right, that we are not going to be part of this war, no matter what, until a NATO nation is attacked. So this policy is not just Orban's policy of not sending weapons to Ukraine directly, by the way, because we help the European Fund with our money to give weapons to Ukraine. We didn't stop it, but it's directly not. it's supported by more than 70% of Hungarian society. So basically what the government does in this is doing the bidding of what people want. And that's why Prime Minister Orbán party win the elections against with a supermajority. Before that, the margin was very small, or much smaller between the opposition. When Orbán said that we will not send weapons and we will not be part of the war, many people who were against Fidesz, or the government party, or Christian Democrats, that's the other government party, switched. So actually it was also election time in Hungary, and this played a quite big part of the people's will not to engage on another war, because the two previous wars totally destroyed the country.
Yes. The next question would be about the Iranian weapon supports to Russia. So what's your opinion about this topic, and what are the main threats of these kind of actions? Maybe it's more important in terms of Israel. So
yeah, sure. So I would also like just to follow up on this. Initially, that was the main reactions. I think now, if you ask generally Israeli society, hey, what's your opinion on the Russian-Ukraine war? Most people would say, is that still going on?
Okay.
Right? Okay, we have so many more pressing priorities than that, including, you know, a constant drip of terrorist attacks, including this morning a double bombing right over here, where you can see them both from the balcony here, and almost every week there's been over the past year, Iran, you know, and Hezbollah, the economy, Palestinian Authority trying to take Israel to the ICJ. Just so many other things going on aside from the war that's still going on between Russia and Ukraine, right? So that's as far as generally Israeli society. Honestly, I've had people literally tell that to me. Of course, the Israeli government is involved in its international relations. So I would like to also update. It's maintained more or less the same position that it started with, of we're not going to supply direct lethal weapons to Ukraine. Although it's sort of, there's been cracks since, and I'll get to the Iranian issue in a moment. But first, why? I want to explain why does Israel continue that policy, right? Even though it's generally it's aligned with the United States and NATO in a affinity sense. So first of all, Israel's ability to operate in Syrian airspace. So you have to understand the situation. Since 2014, Russia has come in with its air force and larger military to support the Assad regime, right? And to stop it from falling apart. This was also in the face of ISIS in 2014. Russia is sitting on our border, right? It controls Syrian airspace. Now, Iran is active, and Iranian proxies are active in the Iraq-Syria region, both in trying to establish a forward base of IRCG and support for Hezbollah, right? And this is an absolute direct threat to Israel, right? Having Iran sitting just across from the Golan Heights, they could theoretically send missile attacks into the northern part of Israel directly, or to further upgrade Hezbollah's abilities to, right now Hezbollah holds something like 100,000, they say, missiles ready to go if it wants to have another go with Israel, right? So preventing them from getting further capabilities and preventing Iran from establishing itself near Israel's border is Israel's #1 national security issue. Of course, there's the nuclear program in the background, but it's most pressing security issue. And for the past few years, Israel's been dealing with that by using airstrikes to go into Syrian airspace and bomb IRGC facilities and forces and equipment that they sent to Hezbollah. Right? So in order for Israel to continue doing that, or let's say the other way, if Russia wanted to make that difficult for Israel, it could do it very easily. Right, because they're Russian airplanes in the sky, they're controlling the airspace. Even if Russia doesn't want to come into a direct conflict with the Israeli Air Force, but it can, and it might, right? And so our ability to continue having this deconfliction and have Russia allow us to, or to not bother or not to get in the way of Israeli actions in Syria, was one of Israel's most pressing national security interests. Beyond that, there's also naval presence and Israeli gas interests in the Eastern Mediterranean, right? Because Russia's navy also functions in the Eastern Mediterranean, especially with its port at Tarsus in Syria, and Russia emphasizes its ability to function in the Eastern Mediterranean, right? Israel now has growing interests given its newfound gas fields there and its security surrounding them. And so again, if Russia wanted to make that an issue, it could also make that an issue, and Israel doesn't want that to be an issue because it's a very serious interest. And finally is the Russian position regarding Iran. Now, on the one hand, again, Russia supplied nuclear technology to Iran in the terms of its power plants. On the other hand, Russia doesn't want, at least hasn't want, I'm talking over 20 years of cooperation in the nuclear field, it doesn't actually want to see a nuclear armed Iran. Right? It's not in Russia's interest. It's nominally Russia wants to be part of the solution of non-proliferation and keeping that going. And another thing, and it also its support for Iran is not a lacking of tensions in and of itself. Right? Even again, I mentioned its desire to resist Islamic extremism. So Shia extremism, for some reason, it's because it's involved with the state, it gets partly a pass, a partial pass, but it's not of a concern to Russia, and that would also more limit Russia's ability to support Assad and assert its interests in the Middle East. So it doesn't actually want a nuclear Iran, but it gives them material and support. It's also become the lead mediator on the international negotiations regarding Iran's nuclear program, right? When the U.S. and Biden administration wanted to renew its negotiations with Iran, it's essentially become dependent on Russia as the main interlocutor between the two countries now. So Israel needs Russia to be open to its interests on that. Finally, there's also the issue of, like you mentioned, of selling air defense systems to Iran. So initially, on the one hand, this is against Israel because we want to be able to, if need be, undertake a military strike against Iran's nuclear facilities. And Russia signed an agreement to sell them air defense systems like the S-300 and so on. On the other hand, it's consistently delayed actually supplying a working system for over a decade at Israel's behest, right? Because Israel has insisted that this is against our interests and we really don't want you to do this, and we've been willing to cooperate on other things with Russia so that they don't. It's been delaying the supply of those systems and at least refraining from sending them the more advanced ones like the S-400, right? But that could also change. Right, and so all of those interests means that Russia's presence in the Middle East is inherently caught up in Israel's foremost national security interests. So the idea that Israel then, in order to add some sort of ability to Ukraine that the West and NATO can easily provide them on their own and is already doing, and then would risk its working relationship or its functional relationship, or would risk its major security interests that Russia could influence if Israel were to do that. It's just silly. It's just ignoring. It's like moralism. It's not morality. It's moralism. It's saying, oh, you guys got to be on our side. You got to do things, even though it doesn't hurt their national interests. Right, to do those things, definitely not in the same way as Israel, but we want you to do it so that you can show that you're part of the team, or that you're a good player and part of the West, and various be part of the brand. So that's the state of affairs. So what is the last month we've seen now that Iran has directly now started cooperating and supplying Russia with suicide drones that it is with Iranian technology that it's developed. Right, so this. In some ways, it sort of changes the calculation. In other ways, the bottom line, I don't think it really does. Why? So first, it's not just two countries that are not directly, that we don't really have a horse in the race, in our periphery, having a conflict. It's now our major security threat is now almost directly involved, or at least supplying weapons to one side, right? So that has implications for Russia, for Israel, in the sense that, you know, it's a lot more difficult for it to maintain neutrality when our greatest enemy is now on one side of the game. On the other hand, it's also maybe in a way positive. I don't know if it's positive, but here's another implication, is that if up until now, even the past year, the United States has been trying to pursue a conciliatory relationship with Iran, trying to, you know, renew the JCPOA, the nuclear agreement, and, you know, have a working relationship with Iran. Now, how is the Biden administration, where it's on the one hand taken a clear stance, providing, you know, millions of dollars of aid to Ukraine, and it's supporting Ukraine, and now Iran is actively on the other side, and it's supposed to continue pursuing a conciliatory nuclear deal with Iran? Right. So on the one hand, that's sort of to Israel's advantage, considering that the direction of the deal that was probably, that, you know, that was on the table, is something that Israel did not see as advantageous, didn't see as being a good deal. Right. So in some way, this undermines Biden's ability to sell out to Iran. Right. Or makes it more difficult diplomatically for him to sell to Iran at the same time when he's saying that, you know, this is Iran's on the wrong side. So why did I say at the bottom line, though, it doesn't really change things? Because, well, the West is supplying Ukraine with weapons, so now Iran is supplying Russia with drones. Like I said, Iran and Russia's arms cooperation had been going on for 20 years, right? The technology and selling missile defense and all that. So is this really something new? Does this really change any of the other interests that I mentioned up until now? Well, not really, right? So I wouldn't say that, oh, now because Iran is directly on one side or supplying drones, now Israel needs to go and supply something to Ukraine. No, the picture of our fundamental national security interests essentially remains the same.
I see. Attila, do you have anything to add?
Well, Hungary is an outsider in this region. We have one main interest to stop the flow of migration from the region. And here we saw not good Russian moves in terms of Syria. So the 2015 wave was partly done by the Assad regime and in a way enabled by Russia too. And of course what we saw in Belarus was one wave in which Russia was clearly taking part. But as for Iran and Russia, again, for us it's very far. And it's not a close interest. What we see is a rather larger danger with this Russian Iranian and Chinese Iranian. We always forget the Chinese Iranian relationship. That in a way, and I don't want to go to theory because theory is always problematic to apply, and especially an old theory to the new realities. But this is somehow what the heartland power is building up in front of our eyes, like China and Russia and Iran, Pakistan, and some other smaller players. And if they get really close next to each other and they cooperate much more closely, these countries can really challenge the West. And I don't think that the Western policy was very wise in that sense that we were, as you said, and I always talk about moralism is the worst policy even for moral goals, because we destroyed the balance with Russia. And we somehow, I'm not saying in that sense that Russia is responsible for this war 100%, at least for the 2022 war. But for the misunderstanding of Russian, let's say, red lines, in a way led to this. And this is leading to closer Russian-Iranian and closer Russian-Chinese relationship. And if we create, with our very nice moralistic policy, the heartland power of challengers, then the balance of power may change to the direction of not the West. Because China, Russia, Iran, Pakistan and some other smaller players together, they are really significant. And this is not good for Israel. This is not good for Europe. and this is not good for even for the United States, who are definitely playing a different league. Everything what happens in Syria, everything what happens in Ukraine and Russia will hurt Israel or Europe far faster than the United States, and to a totally different degree. So that's why we feel that, and I believe that some of the American policy is really naive in a sense. Also, the appeasement of Iran is in a way naive, but to see Russia as a totally, unappeasable player, it's also naive. And it's not about, again, not about what about the Russian regime. It's not a nice regime. Vladimir Putin is not a nice person. But what is the end result of our actions? And I don't think it's good for Israel. I don't think it's good for, of course, it can be good for Israel in 2 points. One is what you mentioned, that maybe US will change policy on Iran. The other is that Iranian resources will be depleted if they are selling a lot. I mean, these are, of course, these are not very sophisticated weapons, but it takes time to make them. And also, I think Russian resources are getting depleted, of course. But in general, I think that this moralism and moralistic policy is even bad for the greater good of mankind. And that's what we should see, that realism is the only way to understand the region, and is the only way to understand the world. Otherwise, we end up in a situation, and again, the most vulnerable in that sense will be Israel, because Israel is part of the Western world. We always, or at least in Europe, we don't always consider it, especially in progressive parts of Europe. But if you come to Europe, you will see that you are basically at home, even if it's a bit different, but still. And if you go to Jordan or if you go to Iraq, and I've been to these countries, Egypt, Morocco, beautiful countries, great cultures, but different, a lot more different. So that's what I see, that we are ending up in a very dangerous global situation with this. And if we push it too far, then we can end up in even bigger trouble. So I'm a bit afraid, but this was not a direct, it's more like a reflection of a broader reflection of what you said.
I see. My next question would be that, what is your point of view about the weapon supply of the NATO and the EU to Ukraine? What could be the main consequences?
I think it's mainly go back to Atyla.
Well, I'm at the beginning I was wrong. I was very skeptical if weapons can help, because I thought the Russian offensive, despite being such a weak attacking force, and despite I always believed that I spent weeks with the Ukrainian army, and I always believed that they are getting stronger and stronger. But I still believe that it's a 1 month or 2 because of the air dominance, which didn't happen. But we thought that there will be an air dominance because of the switching of sides that also happened. Some Ukrainian units and some Ukrainian, let's say, political leaders switched sides to Russia. So it will be over before the Western weapons can make an impact. That was my initial assessment. Now I think that Western weapons made an impact. That's not, I think it's obvious. So Kherson could not have been captured without HIMARS. Ukrainians use it in a far more efficient way than I ever thought, because my background, I was in MOD, I was head of defense planning, and we always had a problem how to change from Russian or Soviet systems to Western system. It takes time, a lot of money. People don't understand the logistical part, that it's like not 152 millimeter, but 155, etc., etc. Not only the ammunition, but also how to fit something into a place which was designed for a Russian system. So what I want to say, that Ukraine did remarkably well in this and surprised me, and I was wrong. And I think in that sense, most of the experts were actually wrong when I talked to, because everybody believed that the Russians will end up with a lot of Western weaponry captured, and it didn't happen. But Hungarian stance is very clear, again, that we don't send weapons, and this is basically twofold, because of the bilateral issues and actual fears for our people, and because of the unfortunately strong dependence on Russia. So that's the Hungarian. But of course, we are not saying anything. We are supportive of Poland. We are supportive of the Baltic states. And actually, it's not true that weapons cannot transfer through Hungary. Weapons are transferring through Hungary. Weapons are not transferring directly from Hungary to Ukraine. So we are enabling weapons getting to Ukraine. We are not enabling to get through the area which is inhabited by Hungarian people, the Hungarian minority on the other side of the border, because we see a threat like what's happened in Poland, that there will be a Russian strike and there will be a Ukrainian strike and people die. And of course, people may die on the Hungarian side. So we are, maybe you can say that we are extra cautious in this, and it can be, and I understand if somebody interprets it as pro-Russian, but actually it's being extremely prudent.
Thank you. And to conclude the discussion, lastly, I would like to ask that this whole conflict, how does this whole conflict affected the relation between Israel and Hungary?
Okay. I would say a few things. Well, first, beyond Hungary and Israel's broader relationship with Europe, there was a very successful book published in 2004 by Robert Kagan called Of Paradise and Power, or Power and Paradise, if you're familiar. I recommend it. And what he essentially said there was that America and Europe are living on two different planets, where America is still living in the Hobbesian world where power matters, and Europe thinks that it's entered into a vacation from geopolitics, right? It's paradise. It's living in paradise. It's beyond the need for power. It's beyond war, right? And this mentality, and I think, broadly speaking, it was more or less right, at least at the time in 2004, if you remember, this was right in the Iraq War. But this mentality that had taken hold in mostly Western Europe, that it has gone beyond, it has transcended conflict. It has, cooperative. It's sat down the wolf and the lamb, and got beyond its its previous bloody past, led them to a critical stance toward Israel, right? Because every time Israel then had a war, an operation, or something going on, the attitude of the Europeans was like, look, we've gotten beyond our conflicts. Why don't you just, shake hands with the wolf and get beyond your conflicts, right? They couldn't understand the idea that Israel still lives in the jungle, right? Which was, with real security threats and real security interests. And so that led to this, this constant, criticism and attitude. And so one of the implications of the war is that this has sort of broken. In some ways, Western Europe and Germany included are waking up to the fact that there is no vacation from geopolitics, right? And that their temporary vacation was really, was temporary, and it was in the merit of the fact that the U.S. was taking control of their security needs during the Cold War, which allowed them to believe that they were living in this paradise, right? But now they're sort of waking up to that. And in some ways, this might mean they might be more sympathetic to Israel's situation as a country that lives in a place that has real security interests. Beyond that, they're also trying to arm themselves, right? And Israel is a country who has technologies that they're now interested in. There's now a potential for stronger cooperation, where there's on the table has been talking about Israel selling Germany its Arrow high-level missile defense system, right? And there might be other deals like that along the way. Another implication is energy, right? Israel is now becoming an energy exporter, not at the same scale as the big players, but at some sort of scale. And Europe needs some energy. Right, so it's likely that there might be something to be had there. The East Med pipeline that they had begun to think about, and then it was sort of squashed, might emerge as something as something new potential. And so in that sense, it's good, or the implications have positive implications for Israel's relationship with other parts of Europe. Overall, though, I think I would really agree strongly with what Atyla said about there's a broader issue here. And the broader issue is China, right? The real issue, the real threat to the West, to freedom-loving nations across the world is not Russia. It's China, right? And I see Russia in my eyes is like a mafia, right? They're not nice, right? They're like, that's what the Russian bear, analogy is very apt, right? Meaning, or the mafia, they're not nice, but you can deal with the mafia because they're also rational and they also look out for their interests, right? On the other hand, China today, is, if you're paying attention, anyone who pays attention knows China is looking for a shared destiny for mankind. China is now adopted an expansive ideology, or wants to truly undermine the current system of free nation states. Certainly in its immediate abroad, also its Belt and Road Initiative is, speaks to and shows its aspirations for much broader spheres of influence. Its inroads in Africa and recently in the Middle East, and not just economics. Right? For decades, it was that China just wants to trade in the Middle East, but it has no direct influence. There's no direct interests. That's changing now. It's changing even more now that a lot of this has become more entrenched under the leadership of Xi Jinping. And Xi Jinping, if we thought that maybe his leadership was not going to continue, just became the lifetime dictator of China. Right, so there's no reason to expect that this is going to change, and this is just a huge blind spot. I don't understand how people can say, well, they're going to get caught up and we're going to fight to the end in Ukraine, Russia, where they don't realize that what they're doing is pushing Russia and China together. Whereas what they could do is come to some sort of modus vivendi with Russia, who is at the end of the day, it's also more pragmatic. It's also more acting out of defense, even though I agree with you, it's not excusable. They're definitely the aggressors in this thing. But it was also a misunderstanding and an unwillingness to take on a realist perspective of Russia's interests over 20 years. Now, when I said this, I teach a course to the Israeli Military Academy. I said this exactly a year ago. I was giving a lecture on Russia, disconnected from what was going on, and some of the students were like, "You're saying Russian propaganda." Excuse me. Okay, I will quote you from George Kennan in 1997. Saying what Clinton and NATO is doing, speaking of it, expanding even more into Eastern Europe, is stupid. It is a total misunderstanding of Russia's interests. It's a bear, right? It doesn't mean that it's nice, but if you step on a bear's toes, it's likely that they're going to attack you, right? Whereas they could easily have come into some sort of understanding regarding where the limits of NATO really are. Henry Kissinger wrote in 2014, right, on the background of the crisis in 2014, he said a very simple proposal for how they could resolve this. And part of it is recognizing Ukrainian neutrality when it comes to security, right, and issues, and a number of other things, while at the same time making it clear where the border is, because Russia does need to be deterred from expanding further. But all of this is really just a distraction from the real threat. And so today, the question is, should we sort of push towards some sort of ending to the war that could then resolve the issues, or are we going to double down or intensify the conflict and drag it out as long as possible? Even though I'm not an expert to how the balance of power of tanks and all that add up. But at the end of the day, Russia is obviously a stronger power, and I don't see an end where Russia just folds up and goes home, with its head between its tail between its legs. I don't see that happening, and so it would be a lot smarter for the West, for the world, and for Israel if we could find a way of bringing it toward some sort of resolution that neither Ukraine nor Russia would be happy about, but they could both live with, so that we could get on with facing the real threats to the West and to the stability of the world.
I see.
I totally agree. In a way, I think Ukraine is the victim of Western naivety. And of course, Russia is the let's say, who is doing the massacre in Ukraine in literal sense. But in a way, Western not understanding Russian red lines and sensitivities also played a part. The 2008 summit, the real disregard for Russia as a big fuel station, as it was called, or as not a great power, and it didn't help. And actually the main victim of all this misunderstanding, and I'm not saying it wasn't done in a good faith. So I think these people who were proposing Ukrainian NATO membership, they proposed it in a good faith, but they didn't understand what they are playing with. I think I talk about the George W. Bush administration, and I think they did the same mistake in Iraq and in a way in Afghanistan too, of not understanding the word, but being very ideological. And this is the biggest problem of the West, being very ideological. It reminds me really of my time during communism. Sometimes when I go to Brussels, I feel like the 80s come back with the Soviet slogans of how to help Nicaragua, because Nicaragua is in the forefront against the fight of imperialism. And I'm not talking about Ukraine, I'm talking about other issues, because Ukraine is really, being attacked in a very cruel way. But around the world, there are these slogans in windows, even in windows in Brussels or in German towns. So to go back, because the question was about Hungary and Israel, I think these two Western countries which are realists. Of course, Israel is being almost basically the same size as Hungary in terms of population and economy, a bit bigger, but of course a much bigger voice in the West. And one of the reasons why, because Israel was realist and was made to be a realist by its environment, and Israel is rearmed or armed itself as maybe, I think, in terms compared to population, Israel is not maybe, by far the strongest Western army compared to the size of the economy and the country. And here comes a relationship between Hungary and Israel, since Hungary also recognized that this is the word of Mars and not Venus, which is coming. And we started the rearmament program actually way before this 2022 Russian invasion. And one link is to Israel. So we are buying these parts of the Iron Dome system, which is the best system. I don't know if you know that our president was just here, President Novak, and our Minister of Defense was just here. And so we are building a strong military relationship with Israel because we want to learn from Israel how to defend ourselves. And actually that's our advice to our European. That's happening in eastern flank of NATO, but that's our advice that we have to prepare for much worse times. We have to look at Israel, we have to support Israel, and that's Hungarian message within EU, and we have to rearm. Not only against Russia, but also against Russia. So actually what Hungary is doing is not very pro-Russian, since we are rearming ourselves with German, Israeli, American weapons and not Russian ones. And we are trying to develop defense industry partly with the help of Israel in terms of radars and airspace control. We are cooperating with Israel. Maybe we will cooperate in drone technology. We are seeking ways to cooperate in many other ways with Israel. So I think it's in a way two different countries, a very, very different geopolitical environment. But what keeps what makes Israel and Hungary to become almost like friends? Of course, it's very hard to say friends when you talk about geopolitics and interests. That there is a sense of shared view of the world. That it's a world of the next 20 or 30 years. It's a world of dangers. And I think with the election of Mr. Netanyahu, again, the relationship was good in the last 1 year also. The relationship was excellent during Prime Minister Netanyahu's time, and I think it will be excellent again. And this relationship will be based on shared view of many things. And this is, I think, in many relationships, it's even more important than interest when you have a shared view of where the West should go. And I think Israel is part of the West. And Israel was warning the West about many things which we didn't believe, because we believe that we live in paradise. And we are not in paradise. There is no paradise on earth. unfortunately. But definitely maybe the next 20 or 30 years will even be less nice than the previous 20 or 30 years. So we in Europe, we have to be very open to what Israel is saying, because Israel experienced, if not hell, but very big trouble even in the last decades. And as you said just before, we started this day with a double bombing and dead people on the streets of Jerusalem. And actually, that's why we were a bit delayed. Both of us were a bit delayed with the police and traffic jams in Israel. This is Israeli reality. Russian aggression against Ukraine is reality today. The rise of China is reality. The population explosion is a reality. We didn't talk about what would happen not only to Israel but to Europe if Egypt goes down, because Egyptian population growth in 5 years is one Israel or one Hungary. 5 years or even less than 5 years. So we have to cope with issues which are really great. And these countries, Israel, Hungary, and some others, are opening, I think we are opening the eyes of our more ideological friends and allies in Brussels, in certain European capitals. But guys, the time has come to take defense seriously. The time has come to be very pragmatic about geopolitics, about politics in general, and the time has come to forget about slogans and understand issues as they are and not as we wish.
Mm-hmm. I'd like to follow up. I didn't relate directly to Hungary. That actually the only place I've actually been in Europe is in Hungary. It just happens to be that I didn't really go on large trips, but I had a few stopovers in Budapest, and I actually learned that we call it Budapest instead of in English. That for some reason we call it Pest. And another thing that I learned that it's actually like two cities that are connected. Yeah. Right? So that struck me that's interesting because the word Jerusalem is also an amalgam originally of two names, right? Historically in the Bible it's Yeru and Shalem, where it's that sometime in forgotten antiquity it was like two sides that had become unified. And this is why we talk about Jerusalem. We say unified Jerusalem. It's not just today in the political sense. It's in a very deep way that Jerusalem represents this unity, right? And as well, so you said about the values. So if I'll compare to one of the reasons that the U.S.-Israel relationship is strong is because it's sitting on a basis of both strategic and values, right? And that's one of the reasons that it's been strong for many years. And so I think that's really important. I think of all the different countries in Europe, Hungary has stood out for standing for a national identity. Right, and that's something that I think is essential for its existence, right? For any country, if a country does not have an identity, right, and a strong national identity that it's proud of its heritage, that it knows who it is and why it lives, then there will not be national resilience to deal with the difficulties involved in the fact that we don't live in paradise, right? How does Israel live with the fact that people, that there are terrorist attacks on a regular basis and people continue, moving on with their lives? Why? Because there's resilience. Why is there resilience? Because we have a national feeling of a sense of meaning, right? Of why we exist and why we're here beyond the fact that they just want to kill us, or we just exist in order to have a comfortable life and be a sort of from anywhere. Right, and there was a famous, people talk about people that are from anywhere or from somewhere, right? So we're from somewhere, okay. Right? We know where we are, and therefore we can also connect to people who are from somewhere else, right? So in Hungary, they're from somewhere else, but they're from somewhere, right? And I think, and that's also a place where I see Hungary as taking a leadership role in Europe by showing them the way of a place that still believes in something, that they represent something, that there is something good about their heritage. Doesn't mean you have to take everything from your heritage, but as opposed to looking at their heritage saying, oh, we're only bad, we're just constantly hitting yourselves over the chest saying, oh, we've done everything in our history is bad. That's self-implosion, right? It's like self-destruction, right? We can recognize that countries can recognize that they're not that not everything in their heritage is bad, but we take the good and we move forward with that. And so Hungary as well as in many ways Poland and Czechia, but I think Hungary has taken a stronger position in leading the way within Europe of doing that, and so hopefully the stance that Hungary has taken on a number of those issues will continue to set a tone for Europe, who maybe has a chance at reinventing or refinding itself.
Thank you very much. I would like to thank you very much for your answers, and if you don't mind, I would open the opportunity to the audience for some questions as well.
I would have a question to Rafal. How affected is Israel by the effects of the Russian-Ukrainian war? Because in Hungary we have a huge inflation, and do you feel something like that?
Inflation. Well, there is inflation in Israel. I'm sure we're not feeling it as directly as Hungary. There's a bit of the wheat and all that everyone's feeling. Overall, Israel's finances have been managed in a very moderate and very careful way for the past 15 years. And so the groceries prices have risen. That's clear, but not in the, not exorbitantly. And as far as gas and all that goes, we haven't felt as strong. Gas prices have risen a bit, but not like, 50% that you're seeing across Europe. And I don't expect that to happen because our gas is coming from different places. And so, I think I would say it's just, we filled it, but it's a lot more moderate, because we're not in the direct circle. You want to call? Yeah.
Okay, I would like to ask that, as far as I know, refugees are coming from Ukraine, or like Jewish refugees, and also from Russia now to Israel. And how do you see? Is there any clash between them here or tension? Interesting.
First of all, you're absolutely right. I found a data saying that there's been 40,000 new Jews or Jews under the right of return law that have come in the past year. About half from Ukraine, about half from Russia. Why? Because Jews in Russia are feeling, the pressure, the difficulties of the war, the threat of conscription to the Russian army. And, and a lot of people, there was a constant trickle anyway. So they feel, let's try it out over here. I don't know if there's any direct tensions between them. I don't know how much many of the people that are going to come, some of them it might be for pragmatic reasons, but many of them it's also because they feel they have a strong Jewish identity, right? And therefore they want to come to Israel. So in that sense, if in both of these populations their Jewish identity overcomes their, previous or host national identity, it's possible that might not be an issue. I haven't heard anything about that being an issue. I can't say it's not a possibility.
I would have a question to both of you. If we can see it, what are the Russian perspective on the Israeli-Russian and Israeli-Hungarian relations?
Well, I don't think that Russians care much about Israeli-Hungarian relations. It doesn't affect them at all. But for Israel, I think Russia has a respect, because the Russians respect strength, and Israel is strong. And actually, I think they wanted to avoid, in the last almost a decade, with the Syrian war, and also with Iran, as you said, to hurt Israeli interests, because they know very well that even the bear can be hurt by the much smaller Israeli David if Russia goes rogue on Iran or goes rogue on Israeli interest. So I think Russians are really trying to avoid to antagonize Israel. They are very pragmatic about Israel. I think they swallowed an incident which even Russians died when the intelligence gathering plane was downed. So I think Russia is actually a much more rational player than we think. Of course, it's very hard to say that with the irrationality and blindness what they had towards Ukraine, but I think it was their emotions which clouded their judgment. But in the case of Israel, they are very pragmatic. That's how we see it from the outside. As for Hungary, they don't really care what Hungary does with Israel. I'm pretty sure about that.
Yeah, I would agree with you as far as Russians' perceptions of Israel. I agree Russia will respect people who are powerful, and Israel is a powerful actor in the region, and that's why they're willing to take into account our when we make it clear our security needs. There's been a long relationship between Putin and all different various Israeli prime ministers. Again, it doesn't mean it's a loving relationship, but it's one that's respect, of mutual respect and willingness to hear what the other side is saying. Here where they're saying, this is what I like, and here when we say, this is what I must, right? These are my real red lines, right? So again, Russia will not always vote the way we like it in the UN, right? But when we make it clear our red lines, then it's willing to accept that. And I think there's also some sort of deeper or in the larger cultural context, again, because of Russian religious sites in Jerusalem, right? It's very important to their national identity, their Russian Orthodox sites in Jerusalem, right? Russia, again, sees itself as the third Rome, right? Again, as far as Russia is concerned, right, it inherited the mantle of Rome from Byzantium, right? And that was sort of grown and has roots here in Israel as well. So I think that also colors the relationship. There's also, again, when I go further into, or not further back, but more recent history, is the memory of World War II. So Israel has historically accepted or shown appreciation for Russia's defeat of the Nazis, Russia's role in the defeat of the Nazis. And this is very important in Russia's own national identity, and they have national yearly ceremonies of the defeat, and Israel even has some sort of monument of that, right? Not that Stalin was a friend, right? But because of Russia's fighting in World War II, they defeated the Nazis, and he definitely wasn't a friend. So and Israel is supported and will send its representatives to diplomatic representatives to the ceremonies, and I think that Russia really takes that into account. I think they appreciate that. Again, not saying that we have to agree on the deeper value level, but there's a mutual respect in that level.
Thank you very much. Any other questions? If there's no other questions, I would like to really thank you, both of you, these thoughtful comments and answers. And to sum up this whole event, I would like the audience as well your attention. So thank you very much.
Well, thank you guys.